Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring true love. Lonesome Hearts by R. Winterbotham. The Last Letter by Fritz Leiber. Man in a Quandary by L.J. Stecher, Jr. Inconstancy by Roger Dee. Deadline by Walter L. Kleine. Lonesome Hearts by R. Winterbotham, writing as Russ Winterbotham. Originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It seems unnecessary to say that my story began a long time ago, but I do not intend to be subtle. I am not clever, and my lying is unpolished, almost amateurish. So I certainly could not be subtle, which requires both cleverness and an ability to tell the truth and a lie in the same breath. Let us turn back the clock a few ages. I was lying in the sun thinking of love. I understand that you human beings have an aversion to biological discussion, so I will not go into detail. But I must remind you that my love life is quite different from yours, for I am from another planet. At the time under discussion, I was most deeply in love. My heart's desire had no shape, the lovely creature. She had no intelligence, the divine soul. But she was the greatest bit of protoplasm in any galaxy you could name. By our standards, I probably might be called handsome. I was young and healthy. I had all of my genes and chromosomes. My colour was a dirty green that is associated with beauty. The sun warmed my body, and the tidal undulation of my planet's surface rocked me gently. And then she came into my life. She floated gently in the breeze, her dainty figure held aloft by a mere hint of levitation. Sparks of static electricity shot from her tender cilia so brightly that I was forced to exude a layer of protective fibre to protect my visual buds. She sucked a deep breath of cyanic gas into her pulmonary pouch and spoke to me sweetly with a voice like distant thunder. "My dear Iljim, the world is coming to an end." I could not believe her, for she had no intelligence. She only loved to talk. "Perhaps," I said, "but not today." "Very soon, then," said she. Her name was Mjili. I watched her with patronizing amusement. The static electricity showed that she was nervous and upset, but people often get nervous and upset over trivial matters. Now how, I reasoned, could our world come to an end? The other planet has gone on for thousands of years without colliding with us. We circle it, in fact. "No," Mjili said, "that is not our doom. Actually, our world will not cease to exist. Life will end here, that is all." "Ah," I said, "our atmosphere is escaping into space." I sucked air viciously. True, the air was thin. True, the atmosphere was escaping. But there would be breathable amounts for many thousands of centuries yet to come. "Not the air. The food is all gone. Things we eat have ceased to exist." I levitated myself and looked out over the throbbing land. A few years ago, this land had been covered with vegetation. I had come to take vegetation so much for granted that I'd ceased to notice it. Now it was gone. There were no round fruits growing from tender grasses, no tubers dangling from the fungus trees, no legume vines sprawling over the rocks. Everywhere lay desert, barren dunes shaking their crests with tidal motion. I lowered myself to the ground and dug my big fibrocytes into the sod. No green leaves grew there beneath the surface. The soil was dead. This will seriously interfere with our future, Mjili, I said. We might eat each other, she replied, but then there would be no one left. No one? There are many others here. The others are dying, said Mjili, blinking her otic nerves eerily. We soon will be the only ones left. It was indeed a senseless thing to do, to die just because there was no means of going on living. But I must admit I was tempted for a moment. But I hung on to myself, for there was Mjili, and as long as she lived, there was a reason for me to live too. It's not a cheerful prospect, I said, but I suppose death by starvation is the best way out. We will face death as we have lived, cheerfully and fortuitously. And why should we die when there is another world so close? She asked. Are you suggesting interplanetary flight, my dear? I was amused again, even though there was little enough left to be amused at. She crinkled her sense to smell in reply, and I realized I was not being amused at the right time. Anchoring herself by magnetic processes, she began to weave the atmosphere delicately with her taste bud tendrils. Quickly she hollowed the air molecules into a reflective mirror and brought it to focus on our neighboring world. I levitated myself into a position so that I could look into the mirror. The near planet was quite satisfactory. It was the one you know as the Earth. It was young. It was green. Huge fern-like plants grew abundantly on its surface. It was full of food. And near. The trip could be made by levitation, Mjili said. I hung back. Animals might live there. We'd be devoured. I'm not afraid, she said. We might not get hungry for a time. Let us linger here a while. Later, when we get desperate, there'll be time enough for interplanetary flight. I hated the thought of stuffing myself full of air enough to last for the long trip. Mjili lowered her visual buds. I'm going to become a mother, she said. Go then, and become a mother. I'll stay here till I get hungry, and then join you. Mjili unflexed her sense of touch, and I felt sorry for her. If I could be sure, I said, that no wild animals live on the earth, I'd go sooner. She snapped her sense of balance in happiness. I will go first, said she. If everything is pleasant and safe, I will return and let you know. I nodded my otic nerves, and off she went. As you human beings are doubtless aware, space levitation is quite complicated, but not beyond accomplishment. Once you are able to reach the speed of escape, the rest is easy. But Mjili was young and strong, and soon she had disappeared from sight, travelling at a tremendous velocity. I followed her as long as I could with the telescope, and then I lowered myself to the tidal crest of a nearby sand dune and lost myself in metaphysical thoughts. Almost half a year later, I realized that Mjili had been gone longer than I expected. Either she had been eaten by wild animals on the earth, or she had forgotten me. I was beginning to get lonesome, and in a few more months I would get hungry. At the thought of enduring 2 such excruciating pains at the single time, I decided to risk my life. I would travel through space to the earth and try to find my beloved. As you may have guessed, the planet on which we had been living is the one you know as the Moon, and the distance to the earth is comparatively small. The sand dunes now have hardened, and the tidal sway of its surface can be felt only slightly. The Moon no longer turns on its axis, and it has no sweetly scented cyanide in its atmosphere. It has no atmosphere of any sort, but it stands now as it did when I left it, glorious in death. Since I departed, no living thing has trod its soil. My scientific sense instinctively came to the rescue as I approached the earth. I felt a strong gravity wrenching at my vitals, and so instead of trying reverse levitation, I spread my processes so that the atmosphere caught in the folds of my skin, and I came floating gently down to the ground without harm. The earth was much as it had appeared through the molecule telescope. It was covered with green vegetation, good, rich, nourishing stuff, and there was enough to feed Mjili and me for 1,000,000 years. There were no animals of any sort. Again I went to my scientific sense for the answer. I realized that while vegetable life was far advanced, animal life had yet to appear. Mjili was the first of this type of life ever to set foot on terrestrial soil. But where was she? On the moon, I could often locate her 1,000 miles away by a simple radio call. Although the earth was much larger than the moon, I did not doubt that it was within 1,000 miles. So I generated power and issued a call. I waited for the response. It came feebly to my antenna. Using my sense of direction, I pushed through the vegetation in search of her. I did not levitate, because the feebleness of her call indicated she might be hurt and on the ground. Besides, levitation is much more difficult on the earth than on the moon. The reply came stronger to my next call, and I sensed through 7 of my senses that she was near. She was on the ground, probably injured, which explained why she had not returned as she had promised. I came to a patch of wilderness, a great marshy plain. In the middle of this swamp was a crater, like those caused by meteors, a deep, ugly scar in the mud. I shuddered at the thought that my darling Mjili might have landed there. Her weaker scientific sense might not have given her the cue to use her skin as a parachute, and she might have made the fatal mistake of trying to reverse levitate. "Mjili," I called, speaking aloud now. "Mjili, where are you?" "Iljim, I'm here." Yes, the voice came from the crater. Gliding to its rim, I looked down. A pool of water lay on the bottom. A greenish scum covered the surface. The scum moved with 1,000,000 tiny wriggles. "Yes, Iljim," came Mjili's voice. "It is I. But I am no longer one being," and her voice sounded like 1,000,000 tiny chirps joined together. "I landed with such force that I came apart. Now each of my body cells lives a life of its own, and now and then each cell grows fat and becomes 2. I am my sisters. Let's not be subtle about it. Mjili was a microbe, the beginning of animal life on the earth. She lives today. She is and always will be her sisters, her mothers, herselves, and her ancestors. But there are few ancestors, for microbes do not die, just part of themselves die. And I do not die, for I crept away into a hole in the ground, where I will live forever. I do not starve, for roots reach me here, but I miss my love with life with Mjili. I can never be a mother or a sister. I will always be me, a lonesome old bem.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Last Letter by Fritz Leiber. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, June 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. On 10th month 1, 2457 AD, at exactly 9 a.m. Planetary Federation time, but with a permissible error of 1/1000th of a second either way, in the 5th sublevel of New York Robot Postal Station 68, Black Sorter gulped down 10,000 pieces of first-class mail. This breakfast tidbit did not agree with the mail-sorting machine. It was as if a robust dog had been fed a large chunk of good red meat with a strychnine peel in it. Black Sorter's innards went whir-clunk. A blue electric glow enveloped him, and he began to shake as if he might break loose from the concrete. He desperately spat back over his shoulder a single envelope, gave a great huff, and blew out toward the sorting tubes a medium-sized snowstorm consisting of the other 9,999 pieces of first-class mail chewed to confetti. Then, still convulsed, he snapped up a fresh 10,000 and proceeded to chomp and grind on them. Black Sorter was rugged. The rejected envelope was tongued up by Red Subsorter, who growled deep in his throat, said a very bad word, and passed it to Yellow Rerouter, who passed it to Green Rerouter, who passed it to Brown Study, who passed it to Pink Wastebasket. Unlike Black Sorter, Pink Wastebasket was very delicate, though highly intuitive, the machine equivalent of a White Russian countess. She was designed to scan in 3,137 codes, route special delivery space mail to interplanetary liners by messenger rocket, and distinguish 9s from upside-down 6s. Pink Wastebasket haughtily inhaled the offending envelope, and almost instantly turned a bright crimson and began to tremble. After a few minutes, small atomic flames started to flicker from a midsection. White Nursemaid 7 and Greasy Joe both received Pink Wastebasket's distress signal, and got there as fast as their wheels could roll them, but the high-born machine's malady was beyond their simple skills of oil can and electroshock. They summoned other machine-tending and repairing machines, ones far more expert than themselves, but all were baffled. It was clear that Pink Wastebasket, who continued to tremble and flicker uncontrollably, was suffering from the equivalent of a major psychosis with severe psychosomatic symptoms. She spat a stream of filthy irons at Grey Psychiatrist, not recognizing her old friend. Meanwhile, the paper blizzard from Black Sorter was piling up in great drifts between the dark pillars of the sublevel, and flurries had reached Pink Wastebasket's aristocratic area. An expedition of sturdy machines headed by 2 hastily summoned snowplows was dispatched to immobilize Black Sorter at all costs. Pink Wastebasket, quivering like a demented hula dancer, was clearly approaching a crisis. Finally, Grey Psychiatrist, after consulting with Green Surgeon, and even then with an irritated reluctance, as if he were calling in a witch doctor, summoned a human being. The human being walked respectfully around Pink Wastebasket several times, and then gave her a nervous little poke with a rubber-handled probe. Pink Wastebasket gently regurgitated her last snack, turned dead white, gave a last flicker and shake, and expired. Black Coroner recorded the immediate cause of death as tinkering by a human being. The human being, a bald and scrawny one named Potshelter, picked up the envelope responsible for all the trouble, stared at it incredulously, opened it with trembling fingers, scanned the contents briefly, gave a great shriek, and ran off at top speed, forgetting to hop on his perambulator, which followed him making anxious clucking noises. The nearest human representative of the Solar Bureau of Investigation, a rather wooden-looking man named Crumbine, also bald, recognized Potshelter as soon as the latter burst gasping into his office, squeezing through the door while it was still dilating. The human beings whose work took them among the top brass, as the upper echelon machines were sometimes referred to, formed a kind of human elite, just one big, nervous family. "Sit down, Potshelter," the SBI man said. "Hold still a second so the chair can grab you. Hitch onto the hookah and choose a tranquilizer from the tray at your elbow. Whatever deviation you've uncovered can't be that much of a danger to the planets. I imagine that when you leave this office, the solar battle fleet will still be orbiting peacefully around Luna." "I seriously doubt that." Potshelter gulped a large lavender pill and took a deep breath. "Crumbine, a letter turned up in the first-class mail this morning." "Great Scott!" "It is a letter from one person to another person." "Good Lord!" "The flow of advertising has been seriously interfered with. At a modest estimate, 300 million pieces of expensive first-class advertising have already been chewed to rags, and I'm not sure the steel helms, God bless 'em, have the trouble in hand yet. Judas Priest! Naturally, the poor machines weren't able to cope with the letter. It was utterly outside their experience, beyond the furthest reach of their programming. It threw them into a terrible spasm. Pink Wastebasket is dead, and at this very instant, if we're lucky, 3 police machines of the toughest blued steel are holding down Black Sorter and putting a muzzle on him. Great Scott! It's incredible, Potshelter. And Pink Wastebasket dead? Take another tranquilizer, Potshelter, and hand over the tray. Crumbine received it with trembling fingers, started to pick up a big pink pill, but drew back his hand from it in sudden revulsion at its colour, and swallowed 2 blue oval ones instead. The man was obviously fighting to control himself. He said unsteadily, "I almost never take doubles, but this news you bring, good Lord! I seem to recall a case where someone tried to send a sound tape through the mails, but that was before my time. Incidentally, is there any possibility that this is a letter sent by one group of persons to another group, a hive or a therapy group or a social club? That would be bad enough, of course, but—" "No, just one single person sending to another." Potshelter's expression set in grimly solicitous lines. "I can see you don't quite understand, Crumbine. This is not a sound tape, but a letter written in letters. You know, letters, characters, like books." "Don't mention books in this office!" Crumbine threw himself up angrily and then slumped back. "Excuse me, Potshelter, but I find this very difficult to face squarely. Do I understand you to say that one person has tried to use the mails to send a printed sheet of some sort to another?" "Worse than that, a written letter." "Written? I don't recognize the word." "It's a way of making characters, or forming visual equivalents of sound without using electricity. The writer, as he's called, employs a black liquid and a pointed stick called a pen. I know about this because one hobby of mine is ancient means of communication." Crumbine frowned and shook his head. "Communication is a dangerous business, Potshelter, especially at the personal level. With you and me it's all right, because we know what we're doing." He picked up a 3rd blue tranquilizer. But with most of the high folk, person-to-person communication is only a morbid form of advertising, a dangerous travesty of normal newscasting, catharsis without the analyst, recitation without the teacher, a perversion of promotion employed in betraying and subverting. The frown deepened as he put the blue pill in his mouth and chewed it. "But about this pen, do you mean that fellow glues the pointed stick to his tongue and then speaks, and the black liquid traces the vibrations on the paper? A primitive non-electrical oscilloscope? Sloppy but conceivable, and producing a record of sorts of the spoken word." "No, no, Crumbine." Potshelter nervously popped a square orange tablet in his mouth. "It's a handwritten letter." Crumbine watched him. "I never mix tranquilizers," he boasted absently. "Handwritten, eh? You mean that the message was imprinted on a hand, and the skin or the entire hand afterward detached and sent through the mails in the fashion of a Martian reproach? A grisly find indeed, Potshelter." "You still don't quite grasp it, Crumbine. The fingers of the hand move the stick that applies the ink, producing a crude imitation of the printed word." "Diabolical!" Crumbine smashed his fist down on the desk so that the 4 phones and 2 score microphones rattled. "I tell you, Potshelter, the SBI is ready to cope with the subtlest modern deceptions, but when fiends search out and revive tricks from the pre-atomic cave era, it's almost too much. But, great Scott, I dally while the planets are in danger. What's the sender's code on this hellish letter?" "No code," Potshelter said darkly, proffering the envelope. "The return address is handwritten." Crumbine blanched as his eyes slowly traced the uneven lines in the upper left-hand corner. "From Richard Rowe, 215 West 10th Street, horizontal, 2837 Rocket Court, vertical. Hive 37, New York, 319, NY, Columbia, Terra." "Ugh!" Crumbine said, shivering. "Those crawling characters, those letters that you call them, those things barely enough like print to be readable. They seem to be on the verge of awakening all sorts of horrid racial memories. I find myself thinking of fur-clad witch-doctors dipping long-pointed sticks in bubbling black cauldrons. No wonder Pink Wastebasket couldn't take it, brave girl." Firming himself behind his desk, he pushed a number of buttons and spoke long numbers and meaningful alphabetical syllables into several microphones. Banks of coloured lights around the desk began to blink like a theatre marquee, sending Morse code, while phosphorescent arrows crawled purposefully across maps and space charts and through three-dimensional street diagrams. "There," he said at last. "The sender of the letters being apprehended and will be brought directly here. We'll see what sort of man this Richard Rowe is, if we can assume he's human. 7 precautionary cordons are being drawn around his population station, 3 composed of machines, 2 of SBI agents, and 2 consisting of human and mechanical medical combat teams. Same goes for the intended recipient of the letter. Meanwhile, a destroyer squadron of the Solar Fleet has been detached to orbit over New York." "In case it becomes necessary to Z-bomb?" Potshelter asked grimly. Crumbine nodded. "With all those villains lurking just outside the solar system in their invisible black ships, with planeticide in their hearts, we can't be too careful. One word transmitted from one spy to another, and anything may happen. And we must bomb before they do, so that as to contain our losses. Better one city destroyed than a traitor on the loose who may destroy many cities. 100 years ago, 3 person-to-person postcards went through the mails. Just 3 postcard, Potshelter, and went Schenectady, Hoboken, Cicero, and Walla Walla. Here, as long as you're mixing them, try one of these oval blues. I find them best for steady swallowing." Bells jangled. Crumbine grabbed up 2 phones, holding one to each ear. Potshelter automatically picked up a third. The ringing continued. Crumbine started to wedge one of his phones under his chin, nodded sharply at Potshelter, and then toward a cluster of microphones at the end of the table. Potshelter picked up a 4th phone from behind them. The ringing stopped. The 2 men listened, looking doped, Crumbine with an eye fixed on the sweep second hand of the large wall clock. When it had made 1 revolution, he cradled his phones. Potshelter followed suit. "I do like the simplicity of the new on the Puffy Loaf phono commercial," the latter remarked thoughtfully. "The bread that's lighter than air. Nice." Crumbine nodded. "I hear they've had to add mass to the lead foil wrapping to keep the loaves from floating off the shelves. Fact." He cleared his throat. "Too bad we can't listen to more phono commercials. But even when there isn't a crisis on the agenda, I find I have to budget my listening time. 1 minute per hour strikes a reasonable balance between duty and self-indulgence." The nearest wall began to sing. "Mr. J. Augustus Crumbine, we all think you're fine, 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 fine. Now out of the skyey blue come some telegrams for you." The wall opened to a small heart shape toward the centre, and a sheaf of pale yellow envelopes arced out and plopped on the middle of the desk. Crumbine started to leaf through them, scanning the little transparent windows. Electronic soap, better homes and landing platforms, psycho blinkers, your girl next door, poppy whoppies, poopsie whoopsies. He started to open an envelope, then, after a quick look around and an apologetic smile at Potshelter, dumped them all on the disposal hopper, which gargled briefly. "After all, there is a crisis this morning," he said in a defensive voice. Potshelter nodded absently. "I can remember back before personalized delivery and rhyming robots," he observed. "But how I'd miss them now. So much more distingué than the hives with their non-personalized radio, TV, and stereo advertising. For that matter, I believe there are some backward areas on Terra where the great advertising potential of telephones and telegrams hasn't been fully realized, and they are still used in part for personal communication. Now me, I've never in my life sent or received a message except on my walkie-talkie." He patted his breast pocket. Crumbine nodded, but he was a trifle shocked and inclined to revise his estimate of Potshelter's social status. Crumbine conducted his own social correspondence solely by telepathy. He shared with 3 other SBI officials a private telepath, a charming albino girl named Agnes. "Yes, and it's a very handsome walkie-talkie," he assured Potshelter a little falsely. "Suits you. I like the upswept antenna." He drummed on the desk and swallowed another blue tranquilizer. "Damn it, what's happened to those machines? They ought to have the 2 spies here by now. Did you notice that the second, the intended recipient of the letter, seems to be female? Another good Terran name too, Jane Doe. Hive in Upper Manhattan." He began to tap the envelope sharply against the desk. "Damn it, where are they?" "Excuse me," Potshelter said hesitantly, "but I'm wondering why you haven't read the message inside the envelope." Crumbine looked at him blankly. "Great Scott! I assumed that at least it was in some secret code, of course. Normally I'd have asked you to have Pink Wastebasket try her skill on it, but—" His eyes widened and his voice sank. "You don't mean to tell me that it's—" Potshelter nodded grimly. "Handwritten too, yes." Crumbine winced. "I keep trying to forget that aspect of the case." He dug out the message with shaking fingers, fumbled it open, and read. "Dear Jane, it must surprise you that I know your name, for our hives are widely separated. Do you recall day before yesterday, when your guided tour of Grand Central Spaceport got stalled because the guide blew a fuse? I was the young man with hair in the tour behind yours. You were a little frightened, and a group mistress was reassuring you. The machine spoke your name. Since then I have been unable to forget you. When I go to sleep, I dream of your face looking up sadly at the mistress's kindly photocells. I don't know how to get in touch with you, but my grandfather has told me stories his grandfather told him that his grandfather told him about young men writing what he calls love letters to young ladies. So I am writing you a love letter. I work in a first-class advertising house, and I will slip this love letter into an outgoing 10,000 pack and hope. Do not be frightened of me, Jane. I am no caveman, except for my hair. I am not insane. I am emotionally disturbed, but in a way that no machine has ever described to me. I want only your happiness. Sincerely, Richard Rowe." Crumbine slumped back in his chair, which braced itself manfully against him, and looked long and thoughtfully at Potshelter. "Well, if that's a code, it's certainly a fiendishly subtle one. You'd think he was talking to his girl next door." Potshelter nodded wonderingly. "I only read as far as where they were planning to blow up Grand Central Spaceport and all the guides in it." "Judas Priest, I think I have it." Crumbine shot up. "It's a pilot advertisement. Boy next door, or that kind of thing, printed to look like handwrittening, which would make all the difference. And the pilot copy got mailed by accident, which would mean there is no real Richard Rowe." At that instant the door dilated, and 2 blue detective engines hustled a struggling young man into the office. He was a slim, rather handsome, had a bushy head of hair that had somehow survived evolution and radioactive fallout, and across the chest and back of his paper singlet was neatly stamped Richard Rowe. When he saw the 2 men, he stopped struggling and straightened up. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, "but these police machines must have made a mistake. I've committed no crime." Then his gaze fell on the hand-addressed envelope on Crumbine's desk, and he turned pale. Crumbine laughed harshly. "No crime? No, not at all. Merely using the mails to communicate. Ha!" The young man shrank back. "I'm sorry, sir." "Sorry," he says. "Do you realize that your insane prank has resulted in the destruction of perhaps 500 million pieces of first-class advertising, in the strangulation of a postal station and the paralysis of Lower Manhattan, in the mobilization of SBI reserves and the de-mothballing of 2 divisions of GI machines and the redeployment of the solar battle fleet? Good Lord, boy, why did you do it?" Richard Roe continued to shrink, but he squared his shoulder. "I'm sorry, sir, but I just had to. I just had to get in touch with Jane Doe." "A girl from another hive? A girl you'd merely gazed at because a guide happened to blow a fuse?" Crumbine stood up, shaking an angry finger. "Great Scott, boy! Where was your girl next door?" Richard Roe stared bravely at the finger, which made him look a trifle cross-eyed. "She died, sir. Both of them." "But there should be at least 6. "I know, sir, but of the other 4, 2 have been shipped to the Adirondacks on vacation, and 2 recently got married and haven't been replaced." Potshelter, a faraway look in his eyes, said softly, "I think I'm beginning to understand." But Crumbine thundered on at Richard Roe with, "Good Lord, I can see you've had your troubles, boy. It isn't often we have these shortages of girls next door, so that temporarily a boy can't marry the girl next door as he always should. But, Judas Priest, why didn't you take your troubles to your psychiatrist, your group master, your socializer, your queen mother?" "My psychiatrist is being overhauled, sir, and his replacement short-circuits every time he hears the word trouble. My group master and socializer are on vacation duty in the Adirondacks. My queen mother is busy replacing girls next door." "Yes, it all fits," Potshelter proclaimed excitedly. "Don't you see, Crumbine? Except for a set of mischances that would only occur once in a billion times, the letter would never have been conceived or sent." "You may have something there," Crumbine concurred. "But in any case, boy, why did you, written this letter to this particular girl? What is there about Jane Doe that made you do it?" "Well, you see, sir, she's—" Just then the door redilated, and a blue matron machine conducted a young woman into the office. She was slim, and she had a head of hair that would have graced a museum beauty, while across the back chest is an inadequate word, of a paper chemise, Jane Doe was silk-screened in the palest pink. Crumbine did not repeat his last question. He had to admit to himself that it had been answered fully. Potshelter whistled respectfully. The blue detective engines gave hard-boiled grunts. Even the blue matron machine seemed awed by the girl's beauty. But she had eyes only for Richard Roe. "My Grand Central man," she breathed in amazement. "The man I've dreamed of ever since. My man with hair." She noticed the way he was looking at her, and she breathed harder. "Oh, darling, what have you done?" "I tried to send you a letter." "A letter? For me? Oh, darling!" Crumbine cleared his throat. "Potshelter, I'm going to wind this up fast. Miss Doe, could you transfer to this young man's hive?" "Oh, yes, sir. Mine has an overplus of girls next door." "Good. Mr. Roe, there's a sky pilot 2 levels up. Look for the usual white collar just below the photocells. Marry this girl and take her home to your hive. If your queen mother objects, refer her to, Potshelter here." He cut short the young people's thanks. "Just one thing," he said, wagging a finger at Roe. "Don't written any more letters." "Why ever would I?" Richard answered. "Already my action is beginning to seem like a mad dream." "Not to me, dear," Jane corrected him. "Oh, sir, could I have the letter he sent me? Not to do anything with, not to show anyone, just to keep." "Well, I don't know," Crumbine began.
"Oh, please, sir."
"Well, I don't know why not. I was going to say, here you are, miss. Just see that this husband of yours never writtens another." He turned back as the contracting door shut the young couple from view. "You were right, Potshelter," he said briskly. "It was one of those combinations of mischances that come up only once in a billion times. But we're going to have to issue recommendations for new procedures and safeguards that will reduce the possibilities of once in a trillion. It will undoubtedly up the Terran income tax to a healthy percentage, but we can't have something like this happening again. Every boy must marry the girl next door, and the first-class males must not be interfered with. The advertising must go through."
"I'd almost like to see it happen again," Potshelter murmured dreamily, "if there were another Jane Doe in it."
Outside, Richard and Jane had halted to allow a small cortege of machines to pass. First came a squad of police machines with Black Sorter in their midst, unmuzzled and docile enough, though still gnashing his teeth softly. Then, stretched out horizontally and borne on the shoulders of grey psychiatrist, black coroner, white nursemaid 7, and greasy Joe, there passed the slim form of pink wastebasket, snow white in death. The machines were keening softly, mournfully. Round about the black pillars, little mecho mops were scurrying like mice, cleaning up the last of the first-class mail bits of confetti. Richard winced at his evidence of his aberration, but Jane squeezed his hand comfortingly, which produced in him a truly amazing sensation that changed his whole appearance. "I know how you feel, darling," she told him, "but don't worry about it. Just think, dear, I'll always be able to tell your friends' wives something no other woman in the world can boast of, that my husband once wrote me a letter."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Man in a Quandary by L.J. Stecher, Jr. Originally published in Galaxy, July 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Dear Miss Dix 6, I have a problem. In spite of rumours to the contrary, my parents were properly married and were perfectly normal people at the time I was born. And so was I. Normal, I mean. But that all contributed to the creation of my problem. I do not know if you can help me resolve it, but you have helped so many others that I am willing to try you. I enjoin you not to answer this letter in a column. Write me privately, please. You know all about me, of course. Who doesn't? But most of what you know about me is bound to be almost entirely wrong. So I will have to clarify my background before I present my problem. Know, then, that I am Alfred the Magnificent. It surprises you, I imagine, that I would be writing a letter to Miss Dix 6. After all, in spite of the tax rate, I am one of the richest, I will say it, one of the richest men in the world. Every word of that last statement is true. My parents were enormously wealthy, but I have accumulated even more of the world's goods than they ever did, and if they had not been loaded with loot, I would not be here now to be writing this letter to you. Please excuse any lack of smoothness in the style and execution of this letter. I'm doing this all myself. Usually I dictate to a secretary, a live secretary, but you understand that that would not be advisable for a letter of this kind, I'm sure. So, my background. I was born in 2352 and, having passed my infantile IQ test with flying colours, was admitted to the Harvard Crèche for superior children at the usual age of 3 months. The name of Alfred Vanderform naturally had been entered on the rolls much earlier, 10 years earlier, in point of fact. My parents had been fortunate enough to be selected to have 3 children, and I was to be their first. They chose to begin with a son. They had known that they would be chosen, and that I would be a superior child, and had taken the wise precaution of signing me up for Harvard Crèche as soon as the planners had finished drawing up their preliminary charts. In spite of what you may have heard, there was absolutely no chance of falsifying the initial IQ examination, in those days at least. I was a physically normal, mentally superior child. My progress at the crèche was entirely satisfactory. I was an ordinarily above-average genius in every way. At age 6, I left the crèche for my sabbatical year at home with my parents, and it was there that my first disaster occurred. My mother and father moved into the same house while I was there, which was the custom then, and may still be for all I know, in order to provide a proper home-like atmosphere for me. Through some carelessness in original planning, this was also the year that had been selected for the birth of their second child, which was to be a girl. Both parents were to be the same for all 3 of their children. Under usual circumstances, they would have paid enough attention to me so that the disaster would never have been allowed to take place, but plans for their second child must have made them a trifle careless. At any rate, in spite of my early age, an embolism somehow developed and major damage to my heart resulted. It was here that the great wealth of my parents proved invaluable. Prognosis was entirely unfavourable for me. The routine procedure for a 3-offspring couple would have been to cancel the unsuccessful quota and reissue it for immediate production. However, it was too late to arrange for twins in their second quota, and my parents decided to attempt to salvage me. An artificial heart was prepared and substituted for the original. It had a built-in atomic battery, which would require renovation no oftener than every 20 years. Voluntary control was provided through connection with certain muscles in my neck, and I soon learned to operate it at least as efficiently as a normal heart with the normal involuntary controls. The mechanism was considerably bigger than the natural organ, but the salvage operation was a complete success. The bulge between my shoulder blades for the battery and the one in front of my chest for the pump were not excessively unsightly. I entered the Princeton second stage creche for greatly superior children on time, being accepted without objection in spite of my pseudo-deformity. It cannot be proved that any special emolument was offered to or accepted by the creche managers in order to secure my acceptance. My personal belief is that nobody had to cough up. 3 years at Princeton passed relatively uneventfully for me. In spite of the best efforts and assurance of the creche psychologist, there was naturally a certain lack of initial acceptance of me by some of my creche mates. However, they soon became accustomed to my fore and aft bulges, and since I had greater endurance than they, with voluntary control over my artificial heart, I eventually gained acceptance, and even a considerable measure of leadership, insofar as leadership by an individual is possible in a creche. Shortly after the beginning of my 4th years at the Princeton creche, the second great personal disaster struck. Somehow or other, the cause has not been determined to this day, my artificial heart went on the blink. I did not quite die immediately, but the prognosis was once again entirely unfavourable. Considerable damage had somehow eventuated to my lungs, my liver, and my kidneys. I was a mess. By this time, my parents had made such a huge investment in me, and my progress reports had been so uniformly excellent that in spite of all the advice from the doctors, they determined to attempt salvage again. A complete repackaging job was decided upon. Blood was to be received, aerated, purified, and pumped back into the arterial system through a single mechanism which would weigh only about 35 pounds. Of course, this made portability an important factor. Remember that I was only 10 years old. I could probably have carried such a weight around on my back, but I could never have engaged in the proper development of my whole body, and thus could never have been accepted back again by Princeton. It was therefore determined to put the machinery into a sort of cart, which I would tow around behind me. Wheels were quickly rejected as being entirely unsatisfactory. They would excessively inhibit jumping, climbing, and many other boyish activities. The manufacturers finally decided to provide the cart with a pair of legs. This necessitated additional machinery and added about 25 pounds to the weight of the finished product. They solved the problem of how I would handle the thing with great ingenuity by making the primary control involuntary. They provided a connection with my spinal cord so that the posterior pair of legs, unless I consciously ordered otherwise, always followed in the footsteps of the anterior pair. If I ran, they ran. If I jumped, they jumped. In order to make the connection to my body, the manufacturers removed my coccyx and plugged in at and around the end of my spinal column. In other words, I had a very long and rather flexible tail, at the end of which was a smoothly streamlined flesh-coloured box that followed me around on its own 2 legs. A human has certain normally atrophied muscles for control of his usually non-existent tail. Through surgery and training, those muscles became my voluntary controllers for my tail and the cart. That is, I could go around wagging my tail while dragging my wagon. Pardon me, Miss Dick-6, that just slipped out. Well, the thing actually worked. You should have seen me in a high hurdle race, me running along and jumping over the hurdles, with that contraption galloping along right behind me, clearing every hurdle I cleared. I kept enough slack in my tail so I wouldn't get pulled up short, and then just forgot about it. Going off a diving board was a little bit different. I learned to do things like that with my back legs under voluntary control. Speaking of diving boards, maybe you wonder how I could swim while towing a trailer. No trouble at all. I would just put my tail between my legs and have my cart grab me around my waist with a kind of body scissors. The cart's flexible air sac was on its top when it was in normal position, so this held it away from my body, where it would not get squeezed. I would take in just enough air so it was neutrally buoyant, and with its streamlined shape it didn't slow me down enough to notice. I usually breathed or took in my air through the intakes of the cart, and they stayed under water, but there was an air connection through my tail up to the lung cavity anyway, allowing me to talk. So I just breathed through my mouth in the old-fashioned way. Backing up was rather a problem, with my posterior legs leading the way, and dancing was nearly impossible, until I got the idea of having my trailer climb up out of the way onto my shoulders while I danced. That got me by Princeton's requirements, but I must confess that I was never very much in demand as a dancing partner. At any rate, that system got me through my 6th and last year at Princeton. I sometimes believe that I may be considered to be what is occasionally called an accident-prone. I seem to have had more than my share of tough luck. During my last year at Princeton, I got my throat cut. It was an accident, of course. No Princeton man would ever dream of doing away with someone he had taken a dislike to quite so crudely, or messily. By voluntary control of my heart, I slowed the action down to the point where I managed to keep from bleeding to death, but my larynx was destroyed beyond repair. That was when I got my Voder installation. It fitted neatly where my lungs used to be, and because it used the same resonant cavities, I soon learned to imitate my own voice well enough so that nobody could tell the difference, before or after. Actually, it was a minor accident, but I thought I'd mention it because of what the news media sometimes call my inhuman voice. It even enables me to sing, something I never was much good at before that accident. Also, I could imitate a banjo and sing at the same time, a talent that made me popular at picnics. That was the last real accident I had for quite a while. I got through my 2nd and last home sabbatical, my upper school, my first college, and my 2nd college. I was chosen for and got through advanced college with highest honours. Counting sabbaticals, that took a total of 29 years, plus the last of my time at Princeton. And then, an eager youth of 42, I was on my own, ready to make my way in the world. I was smart to avoid the government service that catches so many of us so-called super geniuses. It's very satisfying work and all that, I suppose, but there's no money in it, and I was rich enough to want to get richer. The cart containing my organs didn't get in my way too much. With my athletic days behind me, I taught it to come to heel instead of striding along behind me. It was less efficient, but it was a lot less conspicuous. I had a second involuntary control system built in so that it would stay at heel without conscious thought on my part once I put it there. In my office, I would have it curl up at my feet like a sleeping dog. People told me it was hardly noticeable. even people who didn't work for me. It certainly didn't bother me or hold me back. I started to make money as though I had my own printing press and managed to hang on to most of it. In spite of what the doom criers say, as long as there is an element of freedom in this country, and I think there always will be, there will be ways, and I mean legal ways, of coming into large hunks of cash. Within 10 years, I was not only big rich, I was one of the most important people in the world. A policymaker. A power. It was about that time that I drank the bottle of acid. Nobody was trying to poison me. I wasn't trying to kill myself either, not even subconsciously. I was just thirsty. All I can say is I did a first-rate job with what was left of my insides. Well, they salvaged me again, and what I ended up with was a pair of carts, one trotting along beside each heel. The leash for the second one was plugged into me in front instead of in the back, naturally, but with my clothes on, nobody could tell, just by looking, that they were attached to me at all. The doctors offered to get me by without the second trailer. They figured they could prepare pre-digested food and introduce it into my bloodstream through the mechanism of my original wagon. I refused to let them. I had gotten too used to eating. So whatever I ate was ground up and pumped into my new trailer. Or should it be Preceder? There it would be processed, and the nutriments passed into my bloodstream as required. I couldn't overeat if I tried. It was all automatic, not even hooked into my nervous system. Unusable products were compressed and neatly packaged for disposal at any convenient time, in cellophane. There was, of course, interconnection inside of me between the two carts. I'm told I started quite a fad for walking dogs in pairs. It didn't affect me at all. I never got very good at voluntary control of my second trailer, but by that time my habit patterns were such that I hardly noticed it. Oh yes, about swimming. I still enjoyed swimming, and I worked it out this way. Wagon number 2 replaced number 1 in straddling me, and wagon number 1 hung on to number 2. It slowed me down, but it still let me swim. I quit diving. I couldn't spare the time to figure out how to manage it. That took care of the next 5 years. I kept on getting richer. I was a happy man. Then came the crowning blow. What was left of me developed cancer. It attacked my brain, among other things, and it was inoperable. It looked as if I had only a couple of years before deterioration of my mental power set in, and then it would be the scrap heap for me. But I didn't give up. By that time, I had gotten used to the parts replacement program, and I was very rich, so I told them to get busy and build me an artificial brain as good as my own. They didn't have time to make a neat package job this time. They took over 3 buildings in the center of town and filled them with electronics. You should see the cable conduits connecting those buildings together. Then they bought the Broadway power plant and used most of its output. They ran in new water mains to provide the coolant. They used most of my money, and it took all of my influence to speed things up, but they got the job done in time. It won't do you any good to ask me how they transferred my memories and my personality to that mass of tubes and wires and tapes and transistors. I don't know. They tell me that it was the easiest part of the job, and I know that they did it perfectly. My brain power and my personality came through unchanged. I used them to get rich again in mighty short order. I had to pay my water and power bills. I came out of it, Alfred the Magnificent, and still I'm just as human as you are, even if a lot of people, a few billions of them, I guess, won't believe it. Granted, there isn't much of the original me left, but there's an old saying that glands make the man. Underneath it all, I'm the same Alfred van der Form, the same old ordinary super-genius that I have always been. I have almost finished with the background material Mystic 6, and I'm nearly ready to present you my problem. I am now approaching the age of 60, and had therefore reached the time of selection for fatherhood. I have, in fact, been fortunate enough to be one of the few selected to father 3 children. If you have chanced to hear rumours that money changed hands in getting me selected, let me tell you that they are entirely true. The only thing wrong about the rumours is that none of them has named a big enough amount, not nearly big enough. It isn't that I don't qualify by any honest evaluation. I do. But there has been a good deal of prejudice against me as a father, and even some scepticism about my capability. But that doesn't matter. What does is that I have been selected. What is more, a single superior female was chosen to be mother of all 3 of my children. By what is not at all a coincidence, this woman happens to be my private secretary. She is, I may add, very beautiful. I am just old-fashioned enough to want my children to have all of the advantages that I had myself, including parents who are fully married in the same way that my own mother and father were. Legal ceremony, religious service, everything. So I have asked the chosen mother of my children to marry me, and Gloria, that's her name, has been gracious enough to accept. We are to be married week after next. Now, Miss Dick-6, we come to my problem. How can I tell if Gloria is in love with me, or is just marrying me for my money? Perplexed, Alfred Vanderform, the Magnificent.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Inconstancy by Roger Dee, writing as Roger Dee. Originally published in Amazing Stories, January 1962. Narrated by Tom Trussel. His first day on earth promised to be even worse than Marianne Icona had feared when he left Irmel Orisa his fiancée, to become Mars's first interplanetary ambassador. The frenetic bustle of Denver spaceport, his ominous spiriting away through screaming hordes of spectators, left him bewildered and uneasy. Alone in the first brief privacy of his Denver heptagon apartment, he ideographed a facsimile transmission to Irmel at once. "I long for you already," he said, "and for the serenity of home. Earth people are as barbarous and mercurial as their weather." Babulous decades of taped newsreels and video serials should have prepared him for that inconstancy, but the first-hand reality was appalling. He would gladly have returned home at once, before planetary conjunction's end cut him off for 2 interminable years, but for the inevitable stumbling block. Earth had sent an exchange of her own, and Marianne Icona could not back down without disgracing his planet as well as himself. "Write often," he pleaded, in closing, "that I may take comfort in your steadfast regard even in this simian hurly-burly." The missive finished, he found time for remaining before Ellis, of Diplomatic, arrived to switch on the multisensory projection of his last evening with Irmel. The projection had been cubed in a privileged couple's nook complete with real plants and hermetically sealed fountain, and near its close the 2 of them had sung the traditional song of parting from the ancient Chulcione Seraphi. Ellis arrived all too soon, trailing an aura of Scotch, diplomatic enthusiasm, and geniality. "No time to waste," Ellis said briskly. "Little enough of it before you leave us, and you're going to see Earth from pole to pole. The 3 of us begin this evening with a sample of Denver nightlife." "3? "Came only to brief you," Ellis said. "Found a guide for you. Can't run about unescorted, you know." He answered the door buzzer, and admitted a young woman in evening dress. rushed from the spaceport in what amounted to cloak-and-dagger secrecy. Mariani Corner had until now seen Earthwomen only on video and at indistinguishable distance, and the sudden appearance of this one in the flesh unnerved him completely. The girl was small and slender, well under Mariani Corner's athletic 6-foot height. She was warmly and roundly vital, with a stunning abundance of life at which the two-dimensional simulacra of recorded soap opera could only hint. "Miss Leila Anderson," Ellis introduced her. "Member of Diplomatic, so it's all in the family." She took the hand that Mariani Corner raised as if to defend himself. "I'm to see that you aren't bored to death here among strangers," she said. "All work and no play isn't good for anyone. Especially," she said to Ellis, "for one so handsome. I didn't dream he'd look so—" "So Terran," Ellis finished before she could say so human. "And why not? We're from the same original stock, separated ages before our history begins. Martian annals run back for millennia, did you know? Goldmine of information. Settle problems our experts have puzzled over for centuries." "I am not truly representative of my people," Mariani Corner said with some bitterness. "A special case, reared from birth for this assignment." The multisensory projector swung into the Tolcichione Serafis' song of parting. Mariani Corner's resonant baritone, operatically assertive above Irma's reedy soprano, filled the room. He shut off the machine abruptly, feeling a sense of desecration that the tender scene had been bared to alien eyes. Still, he felt a puzzling premonitory twinge of guilt when the projection collapsed. Irma had been infinitely desirable when the sequence was cubed. Why should she now seem so sallow and angular, so suddenly and subtly distant? "Remarkable voice," Ellis said. "You could make a fortune with it here." "It was lovely," Leila Anderson said. "Could I hear the rest of it sometime?" "No." He realized his curtness and added, "It is the song of parting for lovers, very personal." He found that he was still holding Leila's hand and dropped it hastily. Ellis, who had risen high in Diplomatic for good reasons, stepped competently into the breach. "Night duty calls," Ellis said. "Let's be off." A Diplomatic limousine, without insignia, took them to a nightclub large enough and dim enough to promise anonymity. On the way, a quick summer shower left the streets wet and glistening, and turned the night into a many-scented freshness that was sheer fantasy to one accustomed to the sterile air of sealed underground ways. The rain had ended when they left the car, but the brief moment outside, under a vast openness of night sky empty except for dispersing clouds and speeding white moon, struck Mariani Corner suddenly cold with too familiar panic. They had found their table before anyone spoke. "Agoraphobia?" Ellis said, in frowning concern. "I should think you'd be conditioned against that, with all the time they've had to prepare you." Leila Anderson put an impulsive hand on the Martian's. "I'm a touch claustrophobic, so I know how it must be," she shivered, "to be buried under all those tons and tons of—" "Immurement is security," Mariani Corner said. "The ultimate stability." "You'll get acclimatized," Ellis said. "It takes time." He broke off to peer through the gloom beyond the dance floor. "Good Lord, there's Ryerson of the Post, camera and all. If he recognizes me, he'll know who Murr is, and—" "Jan," Mariani Corner corrected automatically. "With us, the second name is impersonal. First is used only by loved ones." "Jan, then," Ellis said. "If Ryerson tumbles, he'll want pictures and an interview. Jan will be lionized before he's ready. Can't publicize him until he knows the ropes." "You'd better skip," Leila said. "If we all go, he'll spot us for sure." "Right." Ellis shoved some money at Leila. "Call me at my office when it's safe." When Ellis had gone, and the waiter had brought drinks, they faced each other across the table. Jan visibly on guard, and Leila with the beginning of speculation in her eyes. "Maybe it's better like this, without protocol," she said. "Jan, do you dance in our gravity?" He was bitter again. "Remember my training. I am taller, stronger, and more freakishly agile than any Martian, including my fiancée, has been for thousands of years." Her clear look made him ashamed, and he added, "With us, the dance is an art form only. Here the intent seems different." "It is," Leila said almost grimly. "Finish your drink, Buster. You're going to need it." He needed several before the evening was finished. The Terran dance and its limited variations offered small challenge. Jan mastered it with an ease that delighted Leila and brought tacit envy from other couples. The cocktails may have contributed to his own mixed reactions, lending primitive tactility to Leila's pliant response. Neither of them, when Ryerson of the Post went away with his camera, considered calling Ellis. "I don't often enjoy my work so much," Leila said. "Let's not spoil the evening with diplomacy, shall we?" They left the diplomatic vehicle for Ellis, rented an agency car, and drove through the charged serenity of the night into the mountains. They talked the moon down and the sun up. Nothing took place that might have shocked a reasonably tolerant Joanna, but by dawn they had reached the sort of understanding that comes spontaneously or not at all. "The biologists who tailored me to terrestrial standards," Jan said, "did their work too well. I find myself more Terran than Martian." The immovable obstacle, of course, was Jan's obligation to Urmel, who would be waiting with enduring Martian patience for his return. Leila went into that matter later with Ellis, not so much to enlist his dubious sympathies as to clarify the bristly problem in her own troubled mind. "Martians use our broadcasts as a standard of judgment," Leila said. "And you know where that ends. The more prominent the people in the newscasts, the higher the divorce rate. The more popular a video serial, the greater its emotional shilly-shallying. To Martians, we are the last word in fickleness." "I know," Ellis agreed. "Our cultural geometry was always triangular." "Exactly. So how can Mirjan break the news to his dry little fiancée back home? We're accustomed to inconstancy and to incontinence. We sing corny songs about girls who write jilting letters to their men in service. Our opera flaunts Perkins's and Mesdame's butterfly. But the fact that we enjoy them shocks the ascetic pants off the Martians. Did you know that their population control quota demands a strictly equal sex ratio, so there's never more than one boy for one girl from the beginning? Mirjan simply hasn't it in him to leave Irmel dangling. He'd feel a renegade for the rest of his life." "Mirjan," Ellis noted. "Obviously he's willing enough if you're on a first-name footing." "I can't call him Jan any longer like a stranger. Mirjan is a compromise." Ellis rummaged in his desk and brought out a personnel folder. "Dossier on J. Frederick Thomas, a young man on Mars. Maybe we can turn up an angle through him." The exchange ambassador's folder was neither interesting nor helpful. J. Frederick Thomas stood revealed as a dwarfish scholastic type, complete with massive glasses and receding hairline. "He looks more Martian than Terran," Leila said. "Is that deliberate?" "Mars sent us a man specially bred to fit into our culture, didn't they? Simple job here to turn up a Martian type. Matter of fact, JF's report shows he fits in up there like a native." "Check with him, then," Leila said, "though I can't imagine what help we can expect from a wizened little stick like that." Leila was wrong. J. Frederick Thomas, who quite predictably being paired off with the only unattached female on Mars as his cicerone, had immediately found himself caught in the same thorny dilemma that gouged his opposite number on Earth. Was eager to help. The result of Ellis's inquiry was a swift letter from Irmel Orisa Ir to Mirjan Icona, a letter which Ellis turned over in duplicate, one in Martian ideograph, the other a translation, to Leiber. It broke Irmel's engagement to Jan for the excellent reasons that J. Frederick Thomas was not only more Martian in physique and deportment, but also possessed a fine reedy tenor which blended ever so better with Irmel's soprano in the less poignant duets from the Ciolchione Seraphi. The man never lived, Ellis pointed out, Martian or Terran, no matter how relieved he might be, whose ego wouldn't need attention after a letter beginning, Dear Jan. Shall I let it go on through the mails, or will you? Leiber answered him on her way out. Don't bother, she said. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Deadline by Walter L. Kleine. Originally published in Infinity, September 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Helene Donnelly handed me a cup of coffee, but didn't pour one for herself. I could feel her eyes on me as I drank. Finally she said, For God's sake, Marsh, you could say something. I could, yeah. As the implications penetrated, the coffee slopped over the rim of the cup. I emptied it quickly and gave it back to her. How about a refill? She refilled it and gave it back to me. If we haven't got a chance, she said slowly, I've got as much right to know as you do, Marsh. Have we got any chance? I set the coffee down and stood up. I shrugged and spread my hands. Ask me that 70 days from now, if you're still around to ask, and I'm still around to answer. Then maybe I can tell you yes. Right now, I just don't know. This wasn't included in the plans. She didn't answer. I walked forward and stared out over the crushed cab at the blue-white CO2 ice of the Martian North Polar Cap. 70 days. That was the deadline. The physical deadline. It really didn't matter too much. Mechanically, we'd either make it to the equator and carve out a landing strip for the other two ships, or we wouldn't. We might make that deadline and still miss the other one, the psychological one. My wife was dead. So was Helena's husband. So were the Travises and the Leonards. That left just me and Helena, and according to the reasonably well-proven theories of space crew psychology, she would have to replace my wife and I her husband. It was supposed to be easy, since we wouldn't have been in the same crew if we weren't known to be more compatible than 99 9/10% of the world's married couples. I pictured her in my mind and tried to superimpose wife on the image. It didn't work. I gave it up. Maybe later. It had all happened so fast. 4 days ago, the 8 ships of Joint Martian Expedition 1 had gone into orbit around Mars. 4 men and 4 women in each ship. 40 of the most stable marriages discoverable at the present state of the research, which had resulted in using the stabilizing influence of marriage to stabilize space crews. 3 of those ships were equipped with the streamlined nose shells and wings necessary to make actual landings on Mars. Number 1, my ship, was supposed to make the first landing on skis near the edge of the North Polar Cap. We carried a pair of double-unit sand tractors, each of which had quarters for 4 in the front section and carried a featherweight bulldozer on the trailer. We were supposed to report a safe landing by radio, proceed overland to the equator, and carve out a landing strip, in 70 days. If the radio didn't work, we were to touch off the remaining fuel in our tanks after we had everything clear of the blast area. Right now, a mile or so behind us, the drives and fuel tanks of number 1 were sending merging columns of smoke high into the thin Martian air, a magnificent signal. Only we hadn't touched them off, and they couldn't have ignited on contact and still be going like that. They couldn't have gone much before Helen and I came to, about 7 hours after we hit. About half a mile in front of us, one of the bulldozers lay on its side, a short distance from the wreck of the nose section, slashed open where the tractor had come through it diagonally, missing Helena and myself by inches. The dozer, the wingtips, and the tractor unit, which we had climbed into, were the only things left remotely intact. It was a real, genuine, gold-plated miracle. I didn't know how it had happened, or why. It occurred at the first shock of landing, and that was the last either of us remembered. Maybe one of the skis collapsed. Maybe one of the drives surged when I cut it back. Maybe there was a rock hidden under the ice. Maybe the ice wasn't thick enough. Maybe a lot of things. We'd never know. It was small comfort to be sure that according to both the instruments and the seat of my pants, there was nothing wrong with my piloting. That didn't matter. 60 more people would very probably die if we didn't do the probably impossible. The other ships wouldn't have enough fuel to pull up and get back in orbit if they came down and discovered that the landing strip wasn't there. "So now what?" Helena finally broke the long silence. "We've looked around and picked up enough pieces to maybe get us there. You're the boss. You know how you want to do it, but I've got to help you. How about letting me in on the secret?" I swore silently at the guy who had decided that the younger half of the crews should be conditioned to look to the older half for leadership in emergencies. In space, you don't want leadership. You want coordination and automatic cooperation. "Okay," I said, not turning. "I'll tell you. But are you sure you'd rather not remain in blissful ignorance?" I regretted the sarcasm instantly. "I'm old enough to know the facts of death." "I'll take your word for it, kid. Hell, you already know. 6,000 miles. 70 days. With just 2 of us, it'll probably take 30 of them to hack out a strip. It's simple arithmetic." "I know that, Marsh. But what do we do about it?" "Get some sleep. Then we'll pick up what pieces we can find and jury-rig anything we can't find pieces of. When we find out how much fuel we've got, we can figure out how fast we dare travel. We should be able to find all we can carry. The tanks were self-sealing. When we're sure we've got it all, we take another 8 hours sleep and pull out. From then on, we run around the clock, 10 hours on and 10 off, until something blows up. If anything does, we're probably done. So maybe we've got 1 chance in 50, maybe 1 in 100, 1,000, 1,000,000. It doesn't matter much. Let's get our sleep, and while we're at it, we might try praying a little. This is a time for it, if there ever was one." She was silent a moment, then said, "You know, Marsh, you haven't told me a thing I didn't know." I nodded. "I'm sorry. I'd almost hoped you might know some way out that I haven't been around long enough to pick up." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I'd said enough for a month already, and we both knew it. My speech left an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. Space crews are not selected for their talkativeness. In space, there is next to nothing to talk about, and a large part of pre-space training consists of developing the ability to be silent. Another part consists of eliminating as much as possible of the remaining necessity for talking. So many words, meaning so little, amounted almost to blasphemy, but somehow the situation had seemed to call for them. It was not a situation normally encountered by space crews. The sounds behind me said that she was unfolding the beds, inflating the mattresses, and then slowly stripping off the 3 layers of her spacesuit skin. I waited until I heard the peculiar snap she always made when she removed the inner layer, then turned and began removing my own spacesuit. Space crews are normally nude when the situation does not require spacesuits. It saves weight. I watched her closely as she hung up the suit and crawled slowly between the covers, and tried to feel something remotely resembling passion. I remained as cold as the thin Martian air on the other side of the rubber fabric envelope around us. I gave up the attempt and tried to convince myself that desire would come later, when we've got things organized better and the shock wore off. After all, that had also been included in our training. I shrugged off the rest of my suit and hung it up carefully, strictly from force of habit, and slid into the bunk below hers. I couldn't sleep. I could relax a little, but I couldn't sleep. I've been in space a long time. 11 years, and 5 years in training before that. I flew the 3rd ship around the moon, and the 2nd to land on it. I flew 1/6 of the material that built Lee, the first stepping stone satellite, and 1/20 of those that went into Goddard, the 2nd. I didn't bother keeping track of how much of Lunar City got there in my ship. I flew the first and last ship around Venus, and brought back the report that settled that mystery. Dust. Those were the old days. The days of 2-couple crews and the old faithful Canfield-class 3-steppers. The Cans. The days, too, of the satellite-hopping von Brauns, each of which consisted of a Canfield crew can stuck on the end of a 600-foot winged javelin with 24 times the cargo space of a Canfield. The Super Cans. Just 4 of us then. Myself and Mary, and Ted and Belle Leonard. 4 who might have just as well have been 1. Then Mars. Not that we were ready for it, just that it was a financial necessity to the rest of the project, with Venus eliminated from the picture. Taxes kept us in space. The scientific value of Lee and Goddard and Lunar City wasn't enough for the tax-paying public. They didn't want ice cream. They wanted a chocolate sundae with all the trimmings. Apparently, our public relations people couldn't tell them that the fact that we could get that far in 8 years without an accident did not necessarily mean that we were in a position to shoot for Mars. So we shot for Mars. Ships were no problem, of course. A Canfield could have made it from Goddard to Mars and back, and wouldn't even have needed its 3rd stage to do it. We got the first 7 of the new Lowell-class ball and girder space-only ships, the Cannonballs, and modified the daylights out of 3 old von Brauns for landing purposes. The crew was the joker. We had to have 40 people trained specifically to make the observations and investigations that would justify the trip. Most of the operating crews either didn't have enough training or lacked it entirely. The crews that had started training when we first saw this jump coming weren't ready to be trusted farther than Lee. So we set up 4-couple crews, 2 old, 2 new, much against our better judgment. It worked out better than anybody had seriously expected, but somehow, even after 3 years in the same can, 8 never became quite as nearly 1 as 4 had been. Helena Donnelly wasn't sleeping much either. Not a sound came from the bunk above me. Normally she was a rather restless sleeper. She would be thinking the same things I was. In spite of her relative inexperience, she knew the score. She would be half-consciously looking for me to do something, even though she knew there was nothing I could do that she couldn't handle just as well. Damn the guy that decided to implant that tendency in the younger crew members. I wished there was something I could do to reassure her enough to nullify the effect, but there was nothing. She knew the score. She knew that mechanically we would either make it or not make it. She knew that it was psychologically impossible for two people conditioned to married life in space to continue to exist in sanity in any other relationship. Recombination had been pounded into us since we first began training. We were lucky in a way. There was only one possible recombination. Yeah, lucky. Helena Donnelly was a good kid, the best. But she was just that, a kid. If we didn't make it, she'd never live to be old enough to vote. She'd been in training since she was 14. I'm almost 35. I don't look it. Space doesn't age you that way. But it's all there. I could have recombined with Belle Leonard. It would have been awkward, but I could have done it. Helena could have recombined with Ed Travis without too much trouble. But this way... If we didn't make an honest recombination soon, not just a going through of motions, all the training and conditioning in the solar system wouldn't be able to prevent us from feeling the terrible sense of loss that normally comes with the death of a loved one. I was beginning to feel it already. Helena spoke once while we poked through the wreckage the next day. She said, "I found the rest of the welding torch. It works." She didn't have to. I could see the cloud of steam from half a mile away. When we returned to the tractor, she took off her helmet and went through the motions without any hesitation, but obviously without feeling any more than I did. Just the slightly damp contact of cold lips. "I'm not tired," she said. "I'll start driving." She put on her helmet and climbed down through the airlock. I hung up my helmet and started to peel off the rest of my suit, then stopped and went to the forward window. I tried to imagine a certain amount of grace in the movements as she clambered up the side of the cab and got in through the hole I'd cut in the crumpled roof. But I'd never known anybody who could move gracefully in a spacesuit. Except Mary. Helena was not graceful, not even a little. I watched her start the engine and warm it carefully, constantly checking the instruments. There isn't much that can go wrong with a closed-cycle mercury vapor atomic, even when the reaction is catalytically maintained to keep size and wane down. But if anything did go wrong, it would probably stay wrong. We didn't have any spare mercury. After we'd been moving for about 15 minutes, I went aft and checked the dozer. It was riding nicely at the end of a tow bar that had been designed to pull the trailer it was supposed to have ridden on. If it would just stay there. I watched for a while, then finished peeling off my suit and crawled into my bunk. I still couldn't sleep. It took me an awfully long time to wake up. When I made it, I found out why. I'd only been asleep an hour. "I knew it was too good to last," I said. "What blew up?" "Dozer brakes jammed," she said. "Something wrong with the tow bar." That was fine. Perfect operation for 12 days, 2,600 miles covered. Then it had to give trouble. I rolled out of the bunk. "Well, I didn't think we'd even get this far. Any leaks?" She shook her head. "Fine." That bar was a nightmare of pressure-actuated hydraulics, very small, very light, and very precision. I wouldn't dare to go into it very deeply. Helena moved quietly to the other end of the compartment while I struggled into my suit. It had been that way ever since we started. We'd never tried to go through the motions after that one ineffectual attempt. So far, it hadn't mattered. Driving required all our attention, and after 10 hours up front, there wasn't much problem involved in sleeping, no matter what we had on our minds. Now it would matter. That bar could take a long time to fix, even if I didn't go in very far. Helena would be just sitting around, watching. If she was my wife, it wouldn't have mattered. She waited until I was through the lock before she followed. There were normal tread marks for 100 feet or so behind the dozer, then several 100 feet of shallow ruts. She'd disconnected the dozer brakes and then moved forward and stopped slowly, using the brakes on the tractor itself, to see whether the trouble was in the bar or in the actuators on the dozer. I checked the actuators, brushed out some dirt and sand, and reconnected, then tried to drive away. The brakes were still jammed. "So?" she inquired. "So we take the bar apart." The tech orders were in Ed's head. Don't I know it? I didn't think you knew anything about this stuff. Anything specific, I mean. I don't. But you think you can fix it? No, but I can't make it any worse. She laughed abruptly. True. How long? 5 minutes, 5 days, I don't know. No. Yes. Oh. She turned and went back inside. I relaxed very slowly. Much too much talk again, and all about the much too obvious. We could just as well have wound up at each other's throats. We still might. I pulled off the outer layers of my gloves and turned up the heat in the skin-thin layer remaining. The bar was still jammed when I got it back together 67 hours later. Well, disconnect the damn things and let's move out. We've wasted enough time already. Helena's voice rasped tinnily inside my helmet, barely audible over the gurgle of the air compressor on my back. I already had the left brake actuator off when she spoke. For a fraction of a second I wanted to go up front and slap her fool head off. Then I caught myself and disconnected the right actuator and climbed onto the dozer. From now on, one of us would have to ride it, braking with its own controls when necessary. Let's go, I said, and then without thinking I added, and be sure you give me plenty of warning when you're going to put on the brakes or turn. I was getting as bad as she was. She put the big tractor into gear and pulled out, unnecessarily roughly it seemed to me. Of course, it could have been the bar. The next day, we hit the rough country. Rough for Mars, that is. Just a lot of low, rolling hills, running at odd angles to each other, with an occasional small outcropping of rust-red, eroded rock to make things interesting. We'd known it was there. It was clearly visible through the 1000-incher on Goddard. An ex-mountain range, they told us. Not enough of it left to give us any trouble. They couldn't see the rocks, and they didn't know we wouldn't be travelling according to the book. It was obvious to both of us that riding the brakes on the dozer was a rougher job, and called for the quickest reflexes, which I had. Also, Helena had a hair-fine control over her voice, which I didn't have. Long before we hit the hills, I knew exactly how much braking she wanted from the way she asked for it. We couldn't have coordinated better if we'd been married for years. In spite of that, it was amazing how little ground we could manage to cover in 15 hours, and how little sleep we could get in the other 9.5. Helena stuck to the valleys as much as she could, which saved the equipment, but not the time. She couldn't avoid all the hills. Every so often we'd run into a long gradual rise which terminated in a sharp drop-off. The tractor wasn't safe at an angle of over 40 degrees. It took anywhere from half a day to a day and a half for the dozer to chew out a slot that the tractor could get down. That was hard enough on us, but having to talk so much made it even worse. We were usually all but at each other's throat at the time the day's run was over. I usually spent 3 or 4 hours writhing in my bunk before I finally dozed off. I very seldom heard Helena twisting about in the bunk above me. The hills ended as abruptly as they began, after less than 2 hours driving on the 34th day. We still had almost 1,800 miles to go. "Clear ahead," Helena called back. "How fast?" We both knew we couldn't possibly make it in the 40 days we'd hoped, and that if we did, it wouldn't do us any good. We'd used up slightly over 6 days' worth of fuel for the dozer cutting slots for the tractor. There would be a balance between time and fuel that would give us the most possible days to use the dozer when and if we got there. "What's the active tank reading?" I asked. "0.4. Add that to the 3 inactive tanks, plus the 2 in the dozer, plus the auxiliaries, plus the 1 remaining salvaged extra strapped to the dozer's hood. Split it all up in terms of average consumption per mile at a given number of miles per hour. Balance it against miles to the landing site, days left to L-Day, and dozer average consumption per day." 10 minutes later I called her and asked, "Can you take an extra hour of driving a day?" "If you can, so can I. You've got the rough seat." I knew it was bravado. I did have the rougher ride, but she was a woman, and not a very big one at that. On the other hand, I didn't dare assume anything but that she meant it. She was just itching for a chance to blow up in my face. "Okay," I said, 16 hours a day, an average 14 miles an hour. If your fuel consumption indicates more than 0.2 over cruising, let me know." We covered another 201 miles that day. On the 35th day, we covered 231 miles. On the 36th day, we covered 224 miles. On the 37th day, we had covered 207 miles in the first 14½ hours. There wasn't any warning, either in external physics signs or on the tractor's instruments. 1 minute we were rolling along like a test run at the proving grounds, and the next a 400-foot stream of mercury vapor under pressure was coming out the left side of the tractor. It lasted only a few seconds. That was all it had to. I sat and stared for several long minutes, blinking my eyes and trying to see something besides a pure white line. I heard Helena climb slowly down from the cab and go up through the airlock, yet I really didn't hear anything at all. Finally, I got down and turned on my suit light and took a look at the hole. There wasn't much to see. The hole was no bigger than a small lead pencil, and I probably wouldn't have been able to find it in the dark if it hadn't been surrounded by a slowly contracting area of white-hot metal. We were lucky. We were incredibly lucky. If that mercury had come out at an angle either 1 degree higher or lower than it had, we'd have been minus a thread or a chunk of the tractor's body. I didn't let myself think of how much good that was going to do us without an engine, or what could keep us from each other's throats now. I snapped off my light and went inside. There was certainly nothing we could do tonight. Helena hadn't even taken off her helmet. She was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, hunched over, with her helmet buried in her hands as she might have buried her face in them if her helmet hadn't been in the way. When I got my own helmet off, I could hear her muffled sobbing. I didn't think, I just reacted. I reached her in one short stride and hauled her to her feet by her helmet. I twisted it a quarter turn to the right and jerked it off. I caught her by the collar as she staggered backwards and slapped her hard across each cheek, with my open palm on the left, backhanded on the right. I let go of her and she slumped back to the floor. "Snap out of it, kid," I said harshly. "It isn't that bad." I turned away from her and began to pull off the rest of my suit, starting with a heavy, armoured outer layer of my gauntlets. I had the inner layer half off before she finally spoke. "Marsh?" "Yes?" "I'll kill you for that." "You frighten me." "I'm not kidding." "I know you're not, kid. You're just not thinking straight at the moment. You wouldn't be here if you were the type that could actually commit suicide when it came right down to the fact." "We're dead already." "Then how do you expect to kill me?" "It'll be fun trying, Marsh." It finally hit me that it was asinine, childish, and getting nowhere in a hurry. "Hell, kid," I said. "We've still got an engine in the dozer. It can be done. Maybe not neatly, but it can be done." "Sure," she sneered. "Sure it can be done. The dozer must have almost half the power of this hulk. We'll get there all right. We'll get there about the time the people upstairs pile up on the landing strip that isn't there. Then we can use the dozer to give them a good Christian burial." "Hell, Marsh, there's no sense trying to do it that way. That hole can't be very big. If we take the mercury out of the dozer and add what we can find lying about on the sand, then pour it back in and weld the hole shut, we'll be all right. We'll get there a day or two later, but that won't be nearly as bad as if we try to tow with a dozer. Then we can swap mercury again and use the dozer. Couldn't be any simpler than that." Like a fool, I tried to be logical. "How long do you think that weld would hold, kid? And then where would we be?" "Right where we are now, only maybe a few miles closer. We haven't got anything to lose, and we've got everything to gain." That was the start. In the course of an hour and a half, we covered every possibility and impossibility of the situation. Whatever one of us brought up, the other argued against. We talked like crazy. We were. When it finally penetrated that we'd both known everything we'd covered before we started, I said bluntly, "Shut up. Go to hell." "I suppose I will eventually. Should I expect to see you there?" "No." "I'm sure it can be arranged," I said as I got up. "You're not going to?" she asked, suddenly really alarmed. "No." By that time she was on her feet too. I spun her around and forced her to the floor. Then I tied her hands behind her back with some wire that had been lying on the floor behind me. I didn't try to tie her too tightly, just tight enough to be sure she couldn't get at the knots. She didn't resist nearly as much as I had expected. I repeated the process on her ankles, then gagged her to stop the insane conversation, and put her in her bunk. Then I turned out the lights and crawled into my own. It never occurred to me that there were dozens of things she should cut herself loose with, just lying around the compartment. I awoke and threw my arm up from sheer instinct. I grabbed something soft and half heard a metallic clatter behind my head. There was a weight on top of me, and then the weight and I were on the floor, locked together with a blanket between us. Full consciousness was slow in coming, in spite of the shock of the activity. It seemed better somehow to just stay in that halfway state and enjoy it without knowing why. Finally, gradually, it penetrated that these were the motions that we were going through, but that we were not just going through the motions. This was for real. A nasty question followed the thought. If this was for real, why did she keep wriggling and twisting all the time? The answer was close behind. She never had been able to hold still when her husband held her. It seemed ages before we both realized how unsatisfactory it was to be separated by that blanket, and released each other and lay apart, with the blanket half on me and half on her. After more ages, I got up and turned on the lights. There were certain formalities that really should be observed. While I pulled on the outer skin of my spacesuit, I wouldn't be outside long enough to need any more. Helena quietly picked out the large wrench she dropped at the head of my bunk and put it back in the case it had come from. Love and hate are separated only by the thin edge of a coin. Flip it, and it can come up either way. I picked up a sterile specimen tube and a thin small sheet of metal, locked my helmet in place, and went out. It took me a little longer than I'd expected to find a reasonably large blob of mercury, but I made up for it by getting it into the tube on the second attempt. I was just beginning to feel the cold when I got back to the tractor. Helena had the specimen preservation kit out and open. I sealed the mercury in transparent plastic, made a ring from a piece of wire, bonded the mercury to it, and coated the whole works with more of the transparent plastic. It wasn't much, but then we got out the Bible. Later, we set up a double bunk. We didn't set the alarm. That was our honeymoon. Neither of us said a word in the morning. Actually, it was past noon. We didn't have to. There was only one thing we could do that made the slightest sense. I got out the welder and burned off the tractor's cab, then went underneath and cut through the mountings on the useless engine and everything else that wasn't an absolute essential. Helena dumped everything movable and non-essential from inside. Shortly before dusk, I tossed the now useless welder on top of the other junk and climbed onto the dozer and pulled out. There weren't any brakes on what was left of the tractor, but that would have to not matter. We were going to have to drive round the clock, or not get there in time. A bulldozer is not a fast vehicle under any circumstances. Logically, I couldn't see that we had much chance of covering 1,100 miles in that rig without having to make at least one stop quick enough to collapse the tow bar and land the tractor on top of the dozer. Emotionally, I couldn't believe a word of it. I knew we were going to get there. We did. 48 days after the crash, I drove through the blackened edge of the northernmost marker area and parked just inside its southern tip. When I came up through the airlock, Helena was looking out what had been the forward port of the tractor, which now faced the area we would have to make into a landing strip. When I had the inner layer of my suit half off, she spoke for the first time since we'd been married. "We made it, Marsh." I joined her and looked out into the dusk. It was going to be rough, but we could do it. "Not quite," I said. "We've still got that strip to chew out." She was silent a moment, then said, tightening her arm around me, "I know. I said we made it, Marsh."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.